You really think that thing is going to get you through this course? The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of arrogant confidence that only a 21-year-old in peak physical condition could possess. Cadet Marcus Gallo gestured with a dismissive flick of his chin toward the man's left leg. The man, older than the rest of them by at least a decade, simply continued lacing his boot, his movements methodical and unhurried. The sterile, fluorescent light of the barracks glinted off the polished carbon fiber and titanium of the prosthetic limb that extended from below his knee. It was a marvel of modern engineering, but in this room, a temple dedicated to the worship of physical perfection, it was a glaring imperfection, a mark of weakness. The older man, whose nameplate read Thorn, didn't look up. He merely cinched the lace tight with a final, firm tug. A quiet hush had fallen over the bay of bunks as the other candidates watched, sensing the first culling of the social order. This was the candidate assessment and selection course for the Army's most elite Special Operations Unit, a place where weakness, perceived or real, was a blood scent for the sharks. Thorn finally straightened up, his gaze level, his face a calm, unreadable mask. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held no anger, no fear, no defensiveness. They simply were. "This boot will get me through the course," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, carrying easily through the tense silence. "The leg is just what I used to put it on." He offered no further explanation, no justification. He simply picked up his pack and began to methodically check its contents, the moment of confrontation already dismissed from his mind. Gallo scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips as he turned to his friends. The quiet dignity of the response was lost on him. He saw only evasion. To him, the man was a charity case, an experiment in inclusivity gone too far. This was a crucible designed to forge human weapons, not a place for broken soldiers to play pretend. The whispers started then, a low murmur that would follow Elias Thorne for weeks. They saw the slight limp he couldn't quite hide. They saw the gray threading his temples. They saw the prosthetic, and in it, they saw a liability. They saw a man who had already been broken once, and they were certain this place would simply finish the job. They had no idea they were looking at a man who could not be broken. The first phase of the course was a brutal academic and physical gauntlet. In the classroom, Thorne was a silent presence. While Gallo and his cohort vied to answer the instructor's questions with sharp, textbook responses, Thorne sat in the back, listening. He filled notebooks with precise, block-lettered script, his focus absolute. His silence was misinterpreted as incomprehension. Gallo would lean over to his neighbor and whisper, "Guess it's hard to keep up when you're half machine. Probably some processor lag." The snickers were quiet but sharp. On the physical training field, the assumptions seemed to be proven correct. During the initial sprint drills and agility tests, Thorne was not at the front of the pack. He was solidly in the middle, his performance unremarkable. He had to adjust his technique for certain exercises, taking a moment to find his balance on the prosthetic during complex lunges or box jumps. Each slight hesitation, each moment of recalibration, was a victory for Gallo and the other doubters. They saw confirmation of their bias. They saw a man struggling, a man who didn't belong. What they failed to see was the utter lack of panic in his eyes. They missed the cold, analytical way he assessed each movement, solving the unique physical problem his body presented with the detached patience of a master craftsman. He wasn't competing against them. He was competing against the limitations of his own form, and he was methodically, quietly winning. On his right bicep, a faded tattoo occasionally peeked from the sleeve of his uniform shirt. It was a dark, intricate design, blurred by sun and time, its details nearly impossible to discern. To the others, it was just another piece of faded ink, a relic from a past life. No one noticed that the senior instructors, men with stone faces and years of war in their eyes, would sometimes let their gaze linger on that spot, a flicker of something unreadable, curiosity, perhaps, or a dawning, dismissed recognition, before they moved on. Thorne never spoke of his past. When asked, he would offer simple, vague answers. "I was in the infantry," he'd say. Or, "I've been in for a while." His humility was mistaken for shame, his privacy for a desire to hide a mediocre or failed career. The narrative they built around him was one of a man clinging to a dream long past his prime, a man who couldn't let go. They saw him as an object of pity, and their pity was cruel. The obstacle course, known colloquially as the Punisher, was designed to break men. It was a mile-long stretch of mud, rope, and timber that tested every facet of a soldier's physical and mental fortitude. It was here that Gallo intended to cement his dominance. He moved through the course with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his power and speed earning him shouts of encouragement from the instructors. He was a machine of muscle and will, devouring each obstacle. Thorn, by contrast, was a study in economy. He started the course near the back, his pace steady, his movements deliberate. He didn't rush. On the high wall, while others used explosive power to vault themselves over, Thorn used precise foot and hand placements, leveraging his strength with calculated efficiency. He flowed over the obstacle with less flash than Gallo, but with an equal, if not greater, degree of control. Halfway through, he came upon a younger candidate, his leg tangled in the cargo net, panic beginning to set in his eyes. The instructors stood nearby, clipboards in hand, their faces impassive. This was part of the test. Do you push on for your own time, or do you risk failure to help a teammate? Gallo had flown past the scene moments earlier without a second glance. Thorn stopped. He didn't say much. Breathe, he commanded, his voice calm and low. Look at me. 1 foot at a time, he talked the kid through the problem, showing him how to shift his weight, where to find a secure hold. It cost him precious minutes. When the younger candidate was finally free and moving again, Thorn gave him a firm pat on the back and continued on, his own pace unchanged. Gallo, watching from the finish line where he was catching his breath, saw the interaction and sneered. See that, he said to his friends. He knows he can't win on time, so he's playing the good teammate card. Trying to score points with the instructors, the others nodded in agreement. They saw a political calculation, a cynical ploy. They were blind to the instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring no one was ever left behind. They could not comprehend that for Elias Thorn, the team was always more important than the time. The act of compassion was logged as an act of weakness. The quiet sacrifice was catalogued as a strategic failure. The gap between who they thought he was and who he truly was widened into a chasm. The pressure cooker of the selection course intensified. The days grew longer, the tasks more demanding, the sleep more scarce. Under this immense strain, true character began to surface. Gallo's arrogance sharpened into a brittle edge. He was performing at the top of the class, and he made sure everyone knew it. His voice the loudest in the mess hall, his critiques of others the harshest. He saw Thorn's continued presence in the course as a personal affront, an insult to the high standards he believed he embodied. One evening in the barracks, the exhaustion hanging thick in the air, Gallo decided to force a confrontation. He stood in front of Thorn's bunk, where the older man was meticulously cleaning his rifle, his movements practiced and fluid. I don't get you, old man, Gallo began, his voice dripping with condescension. Why are you even here? This is a young man's game. You're taking the spot of a whole man, someone who could actually contribute. The other candidates fell silent, watching. This felt different, more personal. Thorn didn't stop his work. He slowly wiped down the bolt carrier group with an oiled cloth, his focus absolute. After a long, tense moment, he looked up, his sea-gray eyes meeting Gallo's. There was no heat in his gaze, only a deep, weary patience. We're all just here to serve, Gallo, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's all that matters. The simple, profound truth of the statement was like a foreign language to Gallo. He was here for glory, for status, for the coveted tab that would set him apart. The concept of pure, selfless service was an abstraction he couldn't grasp. Serve? Gallo laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You can't serve if you can't keep up. You can't protect the man next to you if you're a liability. Thorn set down his rifle components with deliberate care. He looked at his hands, then back at Gallo. The most important weapon you have is the person to your left and your right, he said softly. If you haven't learned that yet, then you have a lot further to go than I do. He then returned to his work. The conversation, in his mind, concluded. The quiet rebuke, delivered without malice, infuriated Gallo more than any shouted insult could have. He stormed away, his fists clenched, his certainty about Thorn hardening into a cold, hard stone of resentment. He would prove it. He would prove to everyone that this quiet, broken old man was nothing more than a fraud. The final phase of the assessment was announced. It was a single, culminating event, a legend in the community, known only as the Long Walk. Colonel Westwood, the commanding officer of the entire training command, addressed the candidates himself. He was a figure of immense authority, a man whose quiet demeanor failed to conceal the steel beneath. His chest was a constellation of medals earned over 30 years of service in the shadows. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and commanding, "for 3 weeks, we have tested your strength, your intelligence, and your will. Now, we test your spirit." He described the course, a 40-mile forced march through the unforgiving mountains that bordered the base. Each candidate would carry a 60-pound pack. There were no trails, only a series of navigation points. It was not a race against each other, he explained, but a race against oneself, against the voice that begs you to quit. "The mountain will find your weakness," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the young, nervous men before him. "It will strip you of your pride and your arrogance. It will leave you with nothing but what you truly are." Gallo felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his arena. Endurance was his greatest asset. He would not just finish, he would dominate. He would break the course record, and in doing so, he would finally, definitively expose Thorne as the liability he was. As the candidates were dismissed to prepare their gear, the camera found Elias Thorne. He wasn't boasting or posturing. He sat on his bunk, his pack disassembled around him. He checked every strap, every buckle. He meticulously taped his feet and the stump of his leg, a ritual born of long and painful experience. He loaded his water bladders with an efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions in far less forgiving environments. He moved with a serene focus, a man preparing for a familiar, difficult journey. There was no anxiety in his posture, only a quiet resolve. He looked at the prosthetic limb resting beside him. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool carbon fiber, a silent communion with the piece of technology that allowed him to continue the only life he had ever known. It was not a symbol of his weakness. It was the enduring monument to his strength. The start was a chaotic explosion of energy. At 0400 hours, under a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars, the signal was given. Gallo, true to his word, shot out like a cannonball, leading a small pack of the course's top athletes. They set a blistering pace, their powerful legs eating up the initial flat ground, their headlamps cutting sharp, bouncing cones of light in the pre-dawn gloom. They were a pack of wolves, eager for the kill. Elias Thorne started in the middle of the mass of candidates. His pace was steady, almost plodding. It was a rhythmic, metronomic gait he settled into, a pace that seemed impossibly slow for the task ahead. Those who passed him in the first hour offered him looks of pity or derision. "See you at the finish line, Pops," one shouted as he jogged by. Thorne offered no reply. He simply focused on his breathing, on the placement of each foot, on the feel of the pack on his shoulders. He was an island of calm in a sea of frantic energy. The first 10 miles were a blur of adrenaline for Gallo. He felt invincible. The pack on his back was a part of him, the burn in his thighs a welcome friend. He and 2 other frontrunners traded the lead, pushing each other harder, faster. They were conquering the mountain. Occasionally, his thoughts would drift back to Thorne, and he would smile. He imagined the old man miles behind, probably already considering quitting, the folly of his ambition finally crashing down on him. Gallo felt a grim satisfaction. The natural order was being asserted. He was the future. Thorne was the past. But the mountain was patient. The mountain didn't care about youthful bravado. As the sun rose, the terrain began to change, the gentle slopes giving way to steep, punishing inclines and treacherous, rock-strewn descents. The race was just beginning. At the 20-mile mark, the halfway point, the mountain began to collect its toll. The blistering pace set by Gallo and the leaders was unsustainable. Their sprint had become a slog. The lactic acid was building in their muscles, the weight of their packs now a crushing, hostile burden. The arrogant confidence of the early morning had evaporated under the heat of the sun, replaced by the grim, arduous reality of the task. Gallo was bent over, his hands on his knees, lungs screaming for air. His bravado was gone, stripped away by the relentless incline. He was running on fumes, his body a traitor to his will. It was then that he heard it. A steady, rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. A controlled, even breathing. He looked up, his vision blurry with sweat, and saw a figure moving past him. It was Thorn. He wasn't sprinting. He wasn't even jogging. He was walking with that same steady, relentless pace he'd started with hours ago. There was no sign of struggle on his face, only a mask of deep, unshakable focus. His prosthetic leg moved with a smooth, hypnotic rhythm, a perfect synergy of man and machine. He looked like he could maintain this pace forever. As Thorn drew level with him, he reached out and offered Gallo his canteen without breaking stride. "Stay hydrated, kid," he said, his voice even, not a hint of condescension or triumph in it. It was the simple, instinctual gesture of one soldier to another. Gallo was too stunned, too exhausted, too ashamed to respond. He could only watch as Thorn continued up the mountain, his silhouette shrinking against the vast, unforgiving landscape. One by one, Thorn passed the other exhausted frontrunners. The mockery that had followed him for weeks had been replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. They were witnessing something that defied their understanding. The man they had labeled broken was now outperforming them all. The liability was becoming a legend before their very eyes. He was not just enduring the mountain, he was embracing it. He was in his element. This was not a training exercise for him. It was a homecoming. The finish line was a simple affair. A chalk line on the pavement, a few tents, and a handful of instructors with stopwatches. Standing near the line, separate from the others, was Colonel Westwood. He wasn't there to observe the instructors. He was there to witness the end of the long walk himself, a tradition he honored for every class. The projected finish time for the first candidate was 16 hours. Just after the 14-hour mark, a lone figure appeared on the horizon, moving with that same, impossibly steady pace. It was Thorn. He crossed the line not with a final, gasping burst of energy, but with a controlled, dignified stride. He didn't collapse. He slowly unbuckled his pack, set it on the ground, and stood tall, breathing heavily but fully in command of himself. The instructors stared, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. They checked their watches, then checked them again. He hadn't just beaten the projected time. He had shattered the course record by over 2 hours. As the other exhausted candidates began to trickle in over the next few hours, a crowd formed, their gazes fixed on the quiet man who had defied all their expectations. Colonel Westwood walked over to him, his expression unreadable. The entire area fell silent. The colonel didn't look at Thorn's face. His eyes went directly to the faded tattoo on his bicep. He stared at it for a long moment, the world seeming to hold its breath. "I haven't seen one of those in a long time," Westwood said, his voice quiet, yet carrying with immense authority. He looked up, meeting Thorn's eyes. There was a deep, profound respect in the colonel's gaze. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3rd Battalion. The candidates exchanged confused glances. That was an elite unit, to be sure, but many men had served there. Then Westwood's voice grew even quieter, filled with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. "But you weren't just in 3rd Bat, were you? I was a captain in the JOC that night in the Karangal. I heard the radio calls. I read the after-action report a dozen times. It's a legendary story, one we still teach to young officers." Westwood turned to face the assembled, exhausted candidates. His voice rose, becoming a powerful, ringing declaration that echoed in the mountain air. "You are looking at Sergeant Major Elias Thorn, and he is not a candidate. He is here as part of an observational program for the Joint Special Operations Command." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Then came the final, devastating revelation. 14 years ago, the colonel continued, his eyes locked on Thorn. "In a valley that has claimed more good men than I care to remember, Sergeant Major Thorn's team was ambushed, pinned down, and compromised. With his platoon sergeant wounded and communications down, he single-handedly charged a fortified machine gun nest, eliminating it so his men could pull back. He was hit multiple times, but he kept going. After securing the position, he realized 2 of his young privates were still trapped. He went back for them. He shielded them with his own body while returning fire, and in that act, a rocket-propelled grenade took his leg." The colonel paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He saved all 22 men in his platoon that day. For that action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The silence that followed the colonel's words was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the weight of shame and awe. The world had been turned upside down. The man they had mocked as weak, the man they had dismissed as broken, was a titan, a living legend from the very community they were desperate to join. His prosthetic leg was not a mark of failure. It was a testament to a level of courage and sacrifice they could barely comprehend. Gallo felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. Every arrogant word, every dismissive sneer, every cruel joke replayed in his mind, each one a fresh, hot stab of humiliation. He looked at Thorn, who stood with quiet dignity, his face showing no hint of triumph. No, I told you so. He simply looked tired. The revelation wasn't a victory for him. It was just the truth. Later that evening, long after the official proceedings were over, Gallo found Thorn alone by the barracks, methodically cleaning his gear, just as he had been that night Gallo had confronted him. The memory made Gallo sick to his stomach. He approached slowly, his feet feeling like lead. He didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for something so profoundly wrong? Sergeant Major, Gallo began, his voice cracking, barely a whisper. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. Thorn looked up. He paused his work and held Gallo's gaze for a long moment. He could see the genuine remorse, the self-loathing in the young man's eyes. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. It's okay, son, he said, his voice gentle. You didn't know, but I should have, Gallo insisted, his voice thick with emotion. I should have seen something. I should have known. Thorn set down his cleaning cloth. Pride is a heavy pack to carry, Gallo. It'll wear you down faster than any mountain. It makes you blind to what's right in front of you. He gestured to the empty space on the bench next to him. Sit, Gallo sat, humbled. What you learn out here, Thorn continued, his voice soft and reflective. What really matters, it's not how fast you can run or how much you can lift. It's about what you do when your brother falls. Do you run past him, or do you stop and pick him up? Everything else is just noise. He picked up a small, worn whetstone and began to sharpen his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the quiet evening air. He didn't need a formal apology. He didn't need Gallo's shame. He needed Gallo to understand. He was offering not absolution, but education. A lesson in humility, delivered not with a lecture, but with a simple act of grace. Weeks later, the course was nearing its end. The atmosphere among the candidates had fundamentally changed. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused professionalism. The experience with Sergeant Major Thorn had been a crucible for their character, burning away the dross of pride and ego. Marcus Gallo was almost unrecognizable. The loud, boastful cadet was gone. In his place was a quiet, attentive leader who was always the first to help a struggling teammate, the first to volunteer for the worst duties. During a particularly grueling team-based land navigation exercise, one of the younger candidates slipped on a wet rock, badly twisting his ankle. He was unable to put any weight on it. Without a moment's hesitation, Gallo took the man's pack in addition to his own and helped him limp the final 2 miles to the extraction point, echoing the very kind of act he had once so viciously mocked. He had finally understood Thorn's lesson. The team comes first. Always. The final graduation ceremony was held on the main parade field. The remaining candidates, lean and hard and forged into a single, cohesive unit, stood proudly in their dress uniforms. Colonel Westwood gave a speech, but his words were not about strength or victory. They were about humility and service. From a distance, standing under the shade of a large oak tree, Elias Thorn watched. He was in civilian clothes, his presence unassuming, almost invisible. He wasn't there for recognition or thanks. He was there to see the seeds he had planted begin to grow. He saw Gallo receive his graduation certificate, the young man's face set with a new, sober maturity. Their eyes met across the field for a brief instant. Gallo gave a slow, respectful nod. Thorn returned it, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. His work here was done. True strength was never about the absence of wounds. It was about what you did with them. It was about the quiet dignity with which you carried your scars, and the grace with which you taught others that the deepest fractures can often create the most unbreakable foundations. The legend of the one-legged man who outpaced them all would be told in those barracks for generations, a quiet reminder that the measure of a soldier is not found in the body they possess, but in the indomitable spirit that drives them.